Hello family, welcome to Stories by Tochi. We bring you interesting folk tales. Please subscribe and drop a like for us. This generosity would go a long way for us. Also share to family and friends. And please turn on post notification to stay tuned for more. Thank you as you do so. Now let's get into the story. The day Obi first saw Adora, it was not in a crowded place, nor during a festive gathering where music and laughter competed with the hum of village life, but in the quietness of a late afternoon in Ominaga, when the shadows of the tall palm trees stretched long and restless across the dusty road. Obi had just returned from Enugu, where he worked at a modest printing shop, his clothes smelling faintly of ink, his fingers still bearing traces of black from the machines he had handled all day. He carried no riches with him, only his humble bicycle and the small bag strapped to its carrier. Yet, when he caught sight of Adora standing by her mother's compound, her wrapper tied neatly, and her laughter rising into the air like bells chiming after a storm, something within him shifted. Her presence was like the sudden fragrance of orange blossoms in harmattan, unexpected and lingering, and Obi felt as though the whole road had narrowed into a path leading only to her. She did not notice him at first. She was busy helping her younger brother chase a stubborn goat that had slipped its tether. The scene was ordinary, but to Obi, it carried a sweetness he could not explain. He slowed his bicycle, not to stare openly, but to steal a glance long enough to stamp the moment into his memory. That evening, when he reached his small room, he found himself smiling for no reason, and though he tried to shake it off, the image of Adora, her laughter, her eyes alive like fireflies at dusk, refused to leave him. It was as though a door had quietly opened in his heart, and through it, a new kind of longing entered. In the days that followed, fate seemed to conspire to draw their paths together, as though the spirits of Ominaga themselves were eager for a tale to unfold. Obi would ride past Adora's street after work, and sometimes he would find her fetching water from the community borehole, her steps steady, her arms strong as she balanced the container on her head with the grace of a queen. He would greet her politely, his voice calm, though inside him a river of words longed to flow. She would answer with a smile that never lingered too long, yet it was enough to trouble his sleep at night. By the third week, Obi could no longer bear the silence of admiration. He sought out a reason to stop, pretending his bicycle chain had loosened near her compound, though he had oiled it the day before. Adora noticed his fumbling, and with a quiet laugh, she asked if he needed help. That single exchange was the thread that pulled them into conversation, and once their voices met, it was as though they had known each other for years. Adora was not only beautiful, she was quick-witted, her words smooth like palm oil on warm yam. She spoke of her dreams of seeing beyond Ominaga, of visiting bustling markets in Enugu, of wearing gowns that shone under electric lights. Obi listened, his heart swelling with admiration, though he could not promise her the riches she imagined. All he had was himself, his honesty, and his steady hands. Still, when he looked at her, he believed those things might be enough, because love, he thought, was not measured in coins but in the courage of two hearts choosing each other. It was not long before word of Obi's growing closeness to Adora began to ripple through the narrow paths and compounds of Ominaga. The old women who sat beneath the irako tree each evening whispered about the pair, their voices rising and falling like the rustle of dry leaves. Some said Obi was wise to choose her, for Adora's beauty was a blessing that could light a man's home. Others warned quietly that a woman admired by many eyes often carried desires bigger than one man's pocket. Obi, however, paid little attention to such talk. His heart was already tied to Adora, like a rope securing a canoe to the riverbank. He began to imagine a future with her, not in grandeur but in simplicity, two of them seated together in a small home, sharing laughter, planting cassava in the back garden, raising children whose laughter would echo across the compound. When he walked through the markets of Enugu, he found himself looking at household items with new eyes, calculating what might fit in a new family's life. Adora's name became the song on his lips, a melody that made his ordinary days shine brighter. Though doubts crept into his thoughts at night, doubts about whether he could meet her unspoken expectations, he silenced them with hope. After all, he told himself, a tree does not refuse to grow because the wind blows, it digs deeper roots. One evening, under the wide arms of the old mango tree near the village square, Obi found the courage to speak plainly. The night was warm, and the air carried the distant drumming of children playing by the stream. Fireflies blinked between the grass like little lanterns guiding his words. Obi sat beside Adora, his palms sweating though his face remained calm. He spoke of his affection, of the way her laughter had lodged in his heart like a stubborn song, of his wish to walk beside her not just for a season, but for a lifetime. Adora listened quietly, her gaze steady on him, and when she finally spoke, her voice was soft but clear, like water trickling over smooth stones. She told him she admired his sincerity, that his words carried weight because they were not dressed in false promises. Yet, she also confessed her desire for a life that shone, a marriage that would not only satisfy her heart, but also silence the tongues of her friends who often boasted of weddings where even the chairs seemed carved from gold. Obi heard her words, and though they tightened his chest, he nodded with a small smile. In his heart, he believed love would find a way. That night, as they parted, the moon hanging low like a watchful elder, Obi felt certain that Adora was the woman he would build his future with, even if it meant carrying burdens heavier than any he had ever known. When the families of Obi and Adora first gathered to speak about their union, the atmosphere in Adora's father's compound was rich with expectation. The evening sun fell softly on the raffia fence, and the smell of roasted maize from a nearby stall drifted in with the wind. Obi arrived with his uncle Okafor, his elder brother Afani, and two respected elders from their kindred, each man dressed neatly in traditional attire, their walking sticks tapping the ground with dignity as they entered. They carried bottles of palm wine, kola nuts, and a goat as a symbol of goodwill. Adora's family welcomed them warmly, their voices polite, but laced with the pride of people who believed they had something rare to offer. As the introductions were made, smiles stretched across faces, but underneath, a different current was flowing. Adora's father, a man with a commanding presence, praised Obi for his good character, yet his eyes often drifted to the modest clothes Obi wore, the kind of observation that said more than words. When the kola nuts were broken and prayers offered, the conversation slowly tilted toward the wedding arrangements. At first, it was simple talk, dates, rituals, and who would handle what. But soon the tone changed, like a drumbeat quickening during a dance. Adora's eldest uncle cleared his throat and began listing what would be required. Not just the customary bride price, but additional items, crates of expensive drinks, bags of rice, cash for the youth association, new clothes for Adora's mother, and a generator for the family home. Obi listened with his head bowed, his heart tightening with each word, and though he nodded respectfully, he felt as though he was being asked to carry a mountain on his back. His uncle Okafor gave him a side glance, one that spoke volumes. This was no small road they were being pushed onto. In the days after that meeting, Obi found himself restless. He sat on the wooden stool in his room, staring at the list his brother Afani had written down during the discussions, the ink dark against the paper as though the demands themselves were carved into stone. The list seemed endless, and the more Obi read it, the heavier his spirit grew. He tried to calculate the costs in his mind, adding figures, subtracting savings, and still finding himself buried in numbers that reached beyond his reach. He went to work at the printing shop in Enugu, but even as the machines roared and papers slid across the rollers, his mind was elsewhere. His boss noticed his distracted eyes and asked if he was unwell. Obi forced a smile and said it was nothing, but inside, he was battling a storm. That evening, he stopped by Chaik's house. Chaik, always straightforward, listened to Obi's worries in silence before finally saying, "Obi, no man climbs a palm tree with one hand. Marriage is sweet, but if it begins with debts, peace will never find a home in your compound." Obi sighed, rubbing his face. "Chaik, I hear your words, but what do I do? Adora believes these things are necessary. She says it is only once in a lifetime, and people will mock us if the wedding is not grand." Chaik looked at him steadily, his voice calm but firm. "Better to be mocked for humility than to be destroyed by pride. Remember, the yam you swallow without chewing will surely choke you." But Obi, caught between love and reason, could not let go of the hope that Adora would soften her heart, that she would one day understand that love, not extravagance, was the true foundation of marriage. Weeks passed, and instead of softening, the demands grew sharper. Adora began speaking more openly about what she wanted, her words carrying the kind of confidence that brooked no refusal. She compared their plans with those of her friends who had married in Enugu, describing the rented halls where lights glittered like stars, the musicians who played until dawn, the guests who left with bags full of souvenirs. She reminded Obi that her friends would be in attendance, and she did not wish to be the subject of quiet ridicule. Each time she spoke, her tone was not hostile but firm, as though she was merely stating a truth that could not be bent. Obi listened, swallowing his protests like bitter medicine. At night, he would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, hearing her voice repeat in his mind. Sometimes he wondered if perhaps she was right, if perhaps he was thinking too small. Yet each time he imagined taking loans or borrowing from friends, fear gripped him like a tightening rope. He thought of his late father, a man who had lived simply, whose pride was not in wealth but in integrity. Obi wanted to follow in those footsteps, but love had placed him on a path where every step seemed to lead him further away from what he knew to be true. Still, he kept silent, hoping time would ease the weight. One evening, Obi visited Adeora's compound again, carrying a small bag of oranges from the market. He thought perhaps a gesture of sweetness might soften the tension. They sat together in the veranda as the night breeze rustled the leaves. He tried to speak of the simple joys they could have, meals cooked together, laughter shared under their roof, the blessing of peace that no wealth could buy. Adora listened politely, nodding, but when he finished, she sighed and placed her hand on his. "Obi," she said, her voice soft but unyielding, "I love you, but love alone will not silence the voices of the people. Do you want my friends to laugh at me? Do you want my family to say I chose wrongly?" Her words pierced him, not because they were cruel, but because they were honest from her heart. Obi sat quietly, his fingers tightening around the bag of oranges, his spirit caught between two worlds, the one of his dreams, simple and full of peace, and the one Adora painted, glittering but heavy with expectations. That night, as he rode his bicycle back home, the road felt longer than ever, and the stars above, once a comfort, seemed now to mock him with their unreachable brilliance. Obi woke before dawn, the cock's crow still echoing faintly across Ominaga, his mind heavy with thoughts that refused to sleep. The list of demands had grown longer, Adeora's voice sharper, and the whispers from her family louder. His days had become a battle between what he could afford and what he was being asked to provide. At work in Enugu, even as the printing machines rumbled like restless beasts, he felt as though he were walking on shifting ground. Customers would speak to him, and he would nod, but their words floated past as though they belonged to another world. The truth gnawed at him. His savings were exhausted, his small investments stretched thin, and yet, the mountain of expectation before him stood higher than the tallest Irako tree. On one particularly tense evening, after returning from the shop, he spread his savings on the wooden table in his room. The worn notes looked pitiful against the enormity of what was being demanded. He counted them twice, then thrice, and still they fell short, so short that despair pressed against his chest. For the first time in his life, Obi felt cornered. It was then the thought entered his mind, like a shadow slipping into an open window, that perhaps he needed to borrow. The very word loan tasted sour on his tongue, for his father had taught him that a man who sleeps under the blanket of debt will never find warmth. Yet love, with all its fire and sweetness, had led him to a place where pride bent and dignity trembled. He decided to seek counsel, but not from Chaik this time, for he already knew what Chaik would say, and his heart was too fragile to hear those words again. Instead, he visited his elder brother Ifani, a man known for his cautious wisdom. They sat on a bamboo bench outside Ifani's house as children played nearby, their laughter mixing with the hum of evening crickets. Obi spoke in low tones, his words spilling like water from a broken pot, describing his fears, his exhaustion, and the looming shadow of disappointment that threatened his future with Adora. Ifani listened quietly, his face stern, his eyes searching the ground as though the answer might be written there. When Obi finished, there was silence for a while, broken only by the rustling leaves. Finally, Ifani said, "Obi, the man who borrows to feed a wedding will eat bitterness in his marriage. You must weigh carefully. Do not sell your tomorrow to buy one day of celebration." The words were steady, but Obi's heart was already restless. He argued gently, reminding Ifani that Adeora's expectations were not hers alone but also her family's, that refusing might mean losing her altogether. Ifani sighed, shaking his head slowly. "If love must be bought, then it is not love. But you are a man, and every man must walk his own path." That night, Obi returned home with the weight of his brother's words pressing on him, but still, the image of Adeora's disappointed face haunted him, and his resolve wavered like a flame in the wind. Days turned into weeks, and Adeora's insistence only grew. She spoke of specific things now: a wedding gown from the boutiques in Enugu, jewelry that glistened like the sun on water, drinks imported from Lagos, and vehicles to ferry her bridesmaids. Each request was a stone added to the load on Obi's back, and with each stone, his spine bent lower. At night, he lay awake, staring at the darkness, hearing the echo of her words. One evening, after a particularly heated conversation where Adeora's tone carried both disappointment and warning, Obi could no longer resist the tide that had been pushing against him. The next morning, he dressed in his best shirt, combed his hair neatly, and walked into a bank in Enugu. His legs trembled slightly as he crossed the tiled floor, the smell of polished wood and paper filling his nostrils. The clerk, a young man with sharp spectacles, greeted him politely, and Obi cleared his throat, his voice barely steady, as he explained what he needed. The process was both swift and heavy, like a storm that arrives suddenly and drenches everything in its path. Papers were placed before him, and with each signature, he felt as though a piece of his freedom was being cut away. When at last the check was handed to him, Obi held it carefully, almost fearfully, as though it were both a treasure and a curse. He placed it in the inside pocket of his shirt, close to his heart, but the beating of his heart against it only reminded him of the chains he had just accepted. That night, when he returned to Umyanaga, Obi sat alone in his room, the check laid on the small wooden table before him. The lantern light flickered, casting uneasy shadows across the walls, and the money stared back at him with a silent threat. He had not yet cashed it, yet already it felt like it owned him. He imagined all it could buy: the gowns, the jewelry, the feasts, the music, the laughter of guests. He also imagined what it could have done differently: repairing his mother's roof, starting a small business, securing a future not built on borrowed ground. The thoughts swirled around him, and he buried his face in his hands. After a long silence, there came a knock at his door. It was Chaik. When Obi reluctantly opened, Chaik's eyes immediately fell on the check. He did not scold, nor did he shout. Instead, he spoke quietly, his words carrying the sharpness of truth. "Obi, this money is not bread to fill your stomach. It is a stone tied to your feet. Once you spend it, the river will pull you under. Think carefully, my friend." Obi nodded but said nothing, for inside, his heart was torn in two, one half beating for Adora and her dreams, the other half clinging desperately to the peace that seemed to be slipping further from his reach. The night grew deeper, the crickets louder, but Obi's thoughts refused to rest. He sat staring at the check until his eyes blurred, knowing that the choice he had made was one that could change his life forever. When Obi finally gathered the courage to tell Adora about the loan, the air between them grew as heavy as a sky before rainfall. They were seated in the veranda of her father's compound, the lantern burning low beside them, casting long shadows across the walls. Obi spoke with a trembling calmness, explaining how he had gone to Enugu, how he had signed papers with his own hand, and how he now had enough to cover every expense her family and friends had spoken of. He expected her face to soften, her eyes to shine with gratitude, perhaps even an embrace for his sacrifice. Instead, Adora's expression hardened. She tilted her head slightly, her lips pressed into a line, and after a long silence she asked, "Is this enough? Do you think this will compare with the weddings my friends had? Do you want people to whisper that I married below my worth?" Her voice was not raised, but its edge cut deep into Obi's chest. His throat tightened, and for a moment words abandoned him. He looked at her in disbelief, his heart pounding like drums of a masquerade festival. He had thought the loan would buy peace, but instead, it had opened the door to greater dissatisfaction. The night grew colder, and though the lantern still burned, Obi felt as though he was sitting in darkness. That evening marked the first time Obi's patience fractured. All his life, he had been known as a man of calm temper, one who met storms with quiet endurance. But something inside him snapped. His voice rose, sharp and quivering with pent-up frustration. He told Adora of his sacrifices, of the endless nights he spent worrying, of the shame he felt in signing a loan he never imagined himself taking. He reminded her of the promises they had once made under the mango tree, of the laughter they shared when they had nothing but each other's company. Yet as his words poured out like a river breaking its banks, Adora remained unmoved. She shook her head slowly, as though she were listening to a child who could not grasp the weight of adulthood. Then she said, "Obi, love is sweet, but it cannot erase shame. My friends will laugh if my wedding is not grand. My family will say I settled for less. I cannot live under that kind of ridicule." Her words struck him harder than a whip. He stared at her, his chest rising and falling, the silence between them heavier than iron. For the first time since they met, Obi saw clearly that the woman before him was not the dream he had been chasing, but a vision shaped by other people's eyes. The realization stung, yet he could not walk away, not yet. He sat there, breathing hard, his palms clenched, his heart breaking under the weight of truth. The following days in Umyanaga were cloaked in whispers. The quarrel between Obi and Adora had not been heard by outsiders, but the tension between them became impossible to hide. Adora stopped visiting him, and when they crossed paths, her smile was faint, forced, the warmth gone from her eyes. Obi, on the other hand, carried himself with a quiet heaviness. He went about his work in Enugu, but those who knew him saw the weariness etched into his face, as though years had been added overnight. In the evenings, he avoided the places where he once sat with Adora, choosing instead to sit by himself under the almond tree near the stream, staring into the water as though answers might ripple to the surface. Chike visited him often, urging him to think carefully, to choose peace over pride, to remember that marriage built on appearances would crumble like a house made of palm fronds in heavy rain. Obi listened, but inside he was torn in two directions. His love for Adora still burned, though it was now mixed with pain, while his longing for peace pulled him away from her demands. Nights became restless battles between desire and wisdom, between a heart that refused to let go and a mind that warned of looming disaster. The breaking point came one afternoon when Adora arrived at Obi's compound unexpectedly. She stood tall, her face calm, but her voice laced with finality. She told him plainly that if he could not provide the kind of wedding she desired, then there was no reason to continue. She said she had been patient long enough, that she deserved more, and that her decision was firm. Obi stood frozen, her words echoing through the room like the toll of a funeral bell. His chest ached, and his hands trembled, but he did not beg. He simply watched as she turned and walked away, her steps steady, her figure fading down the dusty road. When the silence swallowed the room, Obi sat on his wooden chair, his face buried in his hands. For the first time, tears fell freely from his eyes. Not because he had lost Adora, but because he realized he had almost lost himself in the process of trying to keep her. That night, he placed the loan papers back on the table and whispered into the darkness, "This money will not bury me." And though his heart still bled, a strange calmness settled over him, as though the storm had broken and the first rays of morning were struggling to pierce through the clouds. The morning after Adora walked away, Obi rose before the sun. His eyes were swollen from a night of tears, but his resolve was clearer than it had ever been. He sat at the wooden table where the loan papers and the check still lay, untouched, staring at them as if they were living things capable of swallowing him whole. The room was quiet, broken only by the distant crowing of roosters and the rhythmic pounding of a pestle from a nearby compound. Obi gathered the papers slowly, folded them with care, and tucked them back into the envelope. As he did so, a strange calmness washed over him, the kind that comes not from joy but from the acceptance of pain. He knew the whispers in the village would grow louder, that tongues would wag about how his marriage had collapsed at the edge of completion. He imagined the mocking smiles, the sly comments about his inability to provide, the laughter behind closed doors. Yet he also knew that if he spent the money he had borrowed, if he carried the weight of that debt into a union already fractured, it would destroy him faster than gossip ever could. As the sky began to brighten, he washed his face, dressed simply in a clean shirt and trousers, and prepared for a journey to Enugu. His legs were steady though his heart still trembled, for he had decided. The loan would return to where it came from, and he would set himself free. The road to Enugu stretched before him like a long reminder of the choices he had made. He pedaled his bicycle slowly, his thoughts wandering with the rhythm of the wheels. The early morning breeze carried the scent of wet earth, and birds flitted above him, as though mocking the heaviness in his chest with their carefree flight. Every push of the pedal was a reminder of the struggle he had endured, of the countless nights when sleep had abandoned him, of the weight of Adora's demands pressing down on his spirit. Yet for the first time in months, Obi felt a sliver of release, a sense that perhaps his suffering was not in vain. When he reached the city, the familiar sounds of Enugu wrapped around him, the cries of traders, the honking of buses, the calls of hawkers selling bread and boiled groundnuts. He walked into the bank with a steady gait, greeted the clerk politely, and placed the envelope on the counter. The man looked at him curiously, asked if he was sure, and Obi nodded without hesitation. As the clerk processed the return, Obi stood silently, his eyes fixed on nothing in particular, his mind strangely light. When the transaction was complete, he stepped outside into the sunlight, inhaling deeply, as though he had just emerged from a river after nearly drowning. The chains he had placed upon himself had not tightened. He had broken free before they could. Outside the bank, Obi found Chike waiting for him. His friend leaned against a wall, arms crossed, eyes filled with concern that softened when he saw Obi's expression. Without words, Chike understood what had transpired. He walked beside Obi as they made their way down the bustling street, neither man rushing to fill the silence. After a while, Chike spoke, his tone low but firm. "Obi, A man who escapes fire should not curse the smoke. You have lost something, yes, but you have also saved yourself from something greater. Obi nodded slowly, his throat tightening with unspoken gratitude. They stopped at a small kiosk where a woman sold akara and pap, and for the first time in weeks, Obi found himself eating with a measure of peace. Chike cracked a joke about the way the akara was shaped, and Obi actually laughed, a sound rusty from disuse but genuine. In that moment, surrounded by the ordinary hum of city life, Obi realized that he had not lost everything. He had lost Adora, yes, but he had gained back his freedom, his dignity, and perhaps even his future. The realization did not erase the pain, but it gave it meaning, and meaning made it bearable. When Obi returned to Umyanaga later that evening, the village seemed unchanged, yet he himself felt different. The gossip had already begun to spread like dry grass catching fire. Neighbors whispered when he passed, some with pity in their eyes, others with mockery. Children who once greeted him with cheerful shouts now stared curiously, as though they had heard stories too big for their small mouths to contain. Obi walked past them quietly, his face calm, his steps unhurried. In his compound, he lit a lantern and sat outside on a low stool, watching the fireflies dance above the grass. The night air was cool, and for the first time in a long while, he allowed himself to breathe deeply. Though his heart still bore scars, he felt a sense of victory in knowing he had not allowed himself to be buried under a mountain of demands. He whispered softly into the darkness, as though speaking to his late father. "I stood, Papa. I stood." The wind rustled through the trees as if answering, and Obi closed his eyes, letting the night embrace him. The world around him might judge, but within himself, he had found a peace that no gossip could steal. Days stretched into weeks, and while Obi continued with his work and life in Umyanaga, Adaora's absence echoed in his heart like the hollow sound of a drum left out in the rain. At first, he struggled with the silence. The places where they once sat together seemed too still, and the evenings felt too long without her laughter spilling into them. Yet, with time, the sharp pain dulled into an ache, and from that ache grew a strength he had never known. People in the village, as people often do, kept talking. Some said Adora had left him because he was not man enough to meet her desires. Others whispered that perhaps another suitor with deeper pockets had won her heart. Obi heard these words, carried on the wind and spoken in hushed voices, but he did not let them pierce him anymore. He had begun to learn the art of silence, the discipline of keeping his spirit calm even when tongues wagged. And in that silence he found clarity. He realized that his love for Adora had been real, but it had been a love weighed down by expectations too heavy for one man to carry. He understood now that it was not lack of effort that broke them, but the distance between two visions of life, one rooted in peace and humility, the other in show and grandeur. Slowly, he accepted that their paths had diverged long before the final goodbye, only it had taken heartbreak for him to see it clearly. It was during one of those evenings, as Obi sat outside watching the moon rise above the tall palms, that Adora returned unexpectedly. She came quietly, her steps cautious, her wrapper tied firmly as though she had dressed in haste. When Obi looked up and saw her, his heart skipped, not from joy, but from the sudden stirring of old wounds. She stood before him, her face less radiant than he remembered, her eyes tired, her shoulders no longer carrying the same pride. For a moment, they simply stared at each other, the air thick with unsaid words. Then she spoke, her voice low, tinged with something like regret. "Obi," she began, "I made a mistake. My friends mocked me when they heard the wedding was off. They laughed at me, saying I chased glory and lost love. I have thought about us, and I see now that you are a good man. I was blind, and I let vanity guide me." Her words tumbled out quickly, as though she feared silence would betray her resolve. She reached out a hand toward him, her eyes pleading, her voice softer as she whispered, "Let us begin again. Let us build from the start." For a heartbeat, Obi felt the old pull, the familiar warmth of her presence, but just as quickly, the memory of sleepless nights, of demands that drained his soul, returned. He breathed deeply, steadying his heart against the storm rising inside him. Obi stood slowly, the night air brushing against his skin, and for the first time, he saw Adora not as the woman who had once made his heart race, but as a lesson carved painfully into his journey. His voice was calm, but his words carried a weight that came from scars healed over. "Adora," he said, "a bird that has once been trapped in a cage does not return when the door is open. I gave you everything I could, even what I did not have. But it was not enough, because your eyes were fixed on what others would say. You speak of regret now, but my heart has learned its own truth. I cannot go back, for I have walked through fire and come out with new skin. To return would be to burn again." His words fell like stones into a quiet river, sinking deep, and Adaora's eyes filled with tears. She tried to speak, but her lips trembled and nothing came. Slowly, she turned away, her shoulders slumped, her steps heavy as she disappeared into the night. Obi watched her go, not with anger, not even with sorrow, but with the calmness of a man who has chosen peace over turmoil. The silence that followed her departure was not empty. It was full of the freedom he had fought so hard to reclaim. Later that night, Obi sat beneath the wide branches of the ancient Irako tree at the edge of Umyanaga. The wind whispered through the leaves, and the stars glittered above as though they were nodding in quiet approval. He leaned back against the tree trunk, closed his eyes, and let the cool air wash over him. For the first time since the storm of love and loss had begun, he felt whole again. The path ahead was uncertain, but it was his to walk, free of debt, free of burdens he could not bear. In the distance, the village settled into sleep, the sounds of crickets rising like a chorus. Obi whispered into the night, his words carried by the wind. "I have lost, but I have not been broken. I have learned, and I have been set free." And in that moment, he knew that though Adora had left an emptiness in his heart, she had also left him with something far greater: the wisdom to know his worth and the strength to guard his peace. The night stretched on, quiet and deep, and Obi sat there beneath the Irako, a man no longer chained by love's illusions but anchored firmly by his own truth. My people, you have heard the story. When love begins to demand more than peace can carry, wisdom must guide the heart. It is better to lose what is not meant for you than to chain yourself with burdens that will sink you. Do not measure your life by the eyes of others, for those eyes will never help you carry your load. Remember, a peaceful home is greater than a grand wedding, and a sincere heart is richer than a pocket full of loans. Let us pray. May your steps never lead you into unions that will drain your soul. May your hands never sign papers that will enslave your tomorrow. May you find partners who love you for who you are, not for what you can spend. May your nights be filled with peace, your days with favor, and your paths with wisdom. Every voice that rises to mock you shall be silenced by the joy of your own journey. Your heart will not be broken beyond repair, and your home will not be built on vanity. And may blessings surround you like the morning sun surrounds the earth. If you believe this prayer, say a loud and joyful amen. Hope you enjoyed this interesting story. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Turn on post notifications. See you on our next story.